Hello everyone, this time around we're going to be talking about file types and file formats, specifically for cross-media output. What that means is sometimes we're going to design for print, sometimes we'll design for web. This is GIT, we do all this stuff. So understanding which file format is going to work best for which type of output or production is important. So let's cover a few things. This will be brief and then we'll move on. So first, when you're working with web, you need to consider a few things. One, we know that it's additive color. We're working with RGB. It's going to be displayed on screens and monitors. So our color space or profile needs to be set according to that information. The bit depth of our file is going to affect how it appears. We need to work with 8 bits in our images as far as output. Now, higher bit depth can be used for editing, of course, but that's the topic for a different class. Compression is a big factor to consider. So when we are saving our images out to go to the web, they're going to be hosted on a server somewhere. They're going to be downloaded by users on mobile devices, on desktops with high bandwidth and with low bandwidth and whatever. So compression is an issue. We don't want to take up a ton of space. We don't want to use up a ton of bandwidth, and we don't want our pages to load slowly. It's becoming less of an issue, but there's just no point in uploading extremely high resolution content that's uncompressed for the web. That's going to affect file size, of course. So we need to be aware of resolution and dimensions and how that impacts the overall weight of the file. Some file formats support transparency, some don't. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. So it just depends. And then portability has to do with whether that file is going to work in a variety of different ways, whether it's transferable, whether it will display properly in one media versus another. So let's take a look at some more details on print now. It's subtractive color. So we remember there's going to be light reflecting off a sheet of paper being filtered through a ink or pigment, and the light that bounces off of that pigment or reflects is what we see, and that's how we perceive the color. Color is made using separations of ink. Those will be CMYK and then any spot colors that get added on. In your reading this week, you'll learn all about spot colors if you haven't covered that already. Resolution is a big issue with print, absolutely, because then you're going to get big problems with your prints if you don't have sufficient resolution. Having all of your assets available is important too. A RIP isn't going to be able to process your files correctly and get them prepped for print if you don't have all the appropriate fonts, image assets, and everything else embedded in your document. Metadata is really important too. This works for the web too, but metadata in print can be used for all sorts of things, including tagging job information along with the file, so that when you send it through the printing process, it comes out the other end, and the printing system has workflow software built in that's going to understand where that needs to go next, if it's getting coated with something, if it's getting folded or bound or stitched or whatever. And then bit depth, same considerations there. Depends on whether you're working or outputting. High bit depth printing isn't such an issue. If you're talking about fine art inkjet printing, sometimes 16-bit printing is a thing. But for the most part, it's going to be 8-bit as well. All right, so a couple of key concepts. We have working files, and then on the next slide, we're going to talk about delivery files. So working files are the files that you work in, obviously. So things like a Photoshop document, InDesign, Illustrator, those are examples of Adobe's working files. So if you're in InDesign, you're working with an unfinished document. It's not prepped for printing yet. It's your workflow. It's your layout. It's going to be an InDesign document. That's not necessarily a delivery format, but that's what's going to be necessary to work in. You're not going to work on a TIFF and just keep saving layers and layers and layers to go into a print project. It's not terribly efficient. Your images will come out of a camera, for example, as a RAW file or a TIFF or even a JPEG. You're going to work on them, edit them, retouch them, whatever, save them as a PSD. You're going to create your vector graphics in an Illustrator file and so on. So working files, when we say that, we're talking about images or documents or graphics that are created and they're in the process of being worked on. Delivery files are just what it sounds like, things that get delivered. So when you upload your images to a website, whether those are buttons or graphics or pictures or whatever, it's going to be a delivery file. Same thing with print. If you're going to send a document to the press or to the print shop, it's going to be a PDF or TIFF, or sometimes even the same working files will be what you send on because that's what's going to work best for that print facility's workflow. So communication is important there, finding out what type of files are going to work best. These two bulleted lists are broken into categories. The top list are things that you're going to use for web. The bottom list are things that you're going to typically use for print. And you don't want to mix those up necessarily. It's going to cause problems. So for example, a PNG file Supports transparency. It's got some great benefits with compression. It works really well for a lot of things on the web. Buttons, logos, all kinds of stuff. Transparency is fantastic. Unfortunately, if you try to put a PNG file in your InDesign layout for an image, it's going to cause problems. The resolution is just not going to print or reproduce well. So make sure that you're not getting those two mixed up. When you're working with print, you want to handle files that are going to support and work well with print. And notice that the top list, those are all output files. They're going to the web. Output files going to print on the bottom. But our working files can be the same regardless. So if we're working on images, let's say high-end commercial photography stuff, we might have access to the raw files or the TIFF files. We're going to save those out as something else. PSD, we're going to place it in an InDesign document for print, or we're going to save it out as a JPEG if it's going to go to the web. All right, and then we're talking about archive files. This is when you're done working with your document, you've finished, and you need to move on to the next project. File management is really important, and archiving and backing up is important. It's outside of the scope of this class, but be aware that you should have a backup system in place of some sort to protect yourself against disaster. Hard drive failures are a real thing, and it'll hit everybody eventually. Anyways, when you're archiving or backing up, again, it depends on what your output is, what type of media you're working with. A JPEG or a PNG or an SVG might be appropriate for some things. A raw file, the original photo backup, PDF, the finished document that's in its highest quality, a TIFF file if it's an image. But ideally, you're going to keep your working documents, your InDesign, PSD, your Illustrator files, things like that, because that's going to have the most information available there. So that if you need to revert to a previous version, if you need to make edits, if you need to output other options. If I have a PSD that I've prepped for printing, customer is happy with the job, but they want to go and make a web version of that, it's really easy if I kept my PSD. If I've only saved a JPEG of something, it's hard to back up and go to print or another thing. Okay, so everybody should be pretty familiar probably with what PDF is. It's fairly universal. But PDF stands for Portable Document Format. It was designed to be a digital print file, basically. So to replace paper in the printing process and transmitting information. And to a large extent, it has done that. But it has been kind of overtaken as a primary format for printing because it has a lot of strengths. It can work on lots of operating systems, lots of softwares. It doesn't matter what fonts you have installed in your system, because those fonts are embedded in the file. Colors, spot colors, separations, images, all those things can be embedded in the file. It can be highly compressed with less loss of quality as other formats. And it supports raster and vector and font and color and all these things in one single file. So it's pretty versatile. You can do a lot with the PDF. For print, it's kind of the standard file format. This is what you use as a PDF. It can be used all over the place too. There are PDFs that can be used for gathering signatures, forms. You guys have all seen these, I'm sure. PDFs on web pages. There's interactive PDFs, PDFs that have page turn effects and interactive content, videos, or 3D objects embedded in them. So PDFs are very versatile.